racing fans, the fondest of memories is of Altoona's Mammoth Lumber Speedway, a gigantic circle big enough to enclose a flock of football fields. On this wondrous wooden saucer, the speed track terrors of the 20s dueled it out. They fought for position high above the ground on planks supported by a spider web of scaffolding. Altoona's wooden track belonged to the fabulous Roaring 20s, and abandoned in 1930 to the ravages of rot, it died with the 20s. Today, of the oil-soaked plank roadway upon which hundreds of drivers gambled their lives, not a splinter remains.
Learning about new abandoned places, or places that no longer exist at all, is what I've spent most of my free time doing over the years. I've been focusing more on my area lately because after traveling all over the state of Pennsylvania filming amazing historic and abandoned locations made me realize that outside of filming abandoned buildings in my area, there was so much more here. Altoona in the present day is much different than it was 100 years ago, or even 50. But when I was a kid enjoying ice cream at the Greenwood Meadows, looking at all of the history on the walls, I noticed a large picture of a racetrack that used to be located just outside of Altoona, called the Altoona Speedway. As a kid in pre-internet days, I couldn't dig up much on it at 9 years old. I didn't hang out with local historians or anyone who would remember the track. I feel like I owe it to that picture a great deal of respect, due to its subliminal effect that it's had on my life, and part of why I do this channel. Finally being able to dig deeper now in 2021, I felt it deserved its own documentary on the channel. But before we get into the Altoona Speedway, let's get into the concept and history of the short-lived board track racing itself. Board track racing was a type of motorsport popular in the United States during the 1910s and 1920s. Competition was conducted on a circular or oval race courses with surfaces composed of wooden planks. This type of track was first used for motorcycle competition, wherein they were called motordromes, before being adapted for use by various different types of racing cars. The majority of American national championship races were contested at such venues during the 1920s. Board tracks proliferated in part because they were inexpensive to construct, but they lacked durability and required a great deal of maintenance to remain usable. Many of the tracks survived for as little as 3 years before being abandoned. With the onset of the Great Depression in the early 1930s, board track racing disappeared rapidly. However, several of its most notable aspects have continued to influence American motorsports up to the present day, including a technical emphasis on raw speed produced by the steep banking, track width to allow steady overtaking between competitors, and the development of extensive grandstands or stadium-style spectator seating surrounding many of the courses. The first board track for motor racing was the circular Los Angeles Motordrome, built in 1910 in the area that would later become the city's Playa del Rey district. Based on the same technology as European velodromes used for bicycle racing, this track and others like it were constructed with 2-inch by 4-inch boards, often with turns banked up to 45 degrees. In some cases, such as the track at Culver City, banking was 50 degrees or more. Longer tracks were later built, some up to 2 miles long by 1915, and lap speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour became commonplace. Interest in motorsport was exploding during this period, and by late 1929 at least 24 board tracks had been built around the country, although by 1931 20 of the 24 had been shut down or abandoned, and from 1932 on there were no more championship level races run on boards. The tracks were relatively inexpensive to construct compared to more permanent facilities. The total facility cost of the 2-mile Tacoma Speedway was just $100,000 in 1915, compared to the $700,000 spent in 1909 just to pave the 2.5-mile Indianapolis Motor Speedway. Racing on these tracks often drew large crowds of paying spectators. In 1915, a crowd of 80,000 was reported in Chicago, 3 weeks after only 60,000 had attended the Indianapolis 500. To attract both competitors and fans, race promoters offered what were then considered sensational amounts of prize money. A total purse of $25,000 was not unusual around the time of World War I. After World War I, the Automobile Association of America's Contest Board resumed and reorganized the national championship system. From the beginning of the 1920 season to the end of 1931, the AAA sanctioned a total of 123 championship racing events on 24 different racetracks, and 82 of those races were run on wooden surfaces. The first track in Playa del Rey was banked at 3.1 pitch, about 20 degrees, but later tracks were built with higher banking, and some motorcycle tracks were banked up to 60 degrees. Even though the physics of such track designs were intuitively obvious, it was not until the construction of the Beverly Hills track in 1919 that builders began to incorporate engineering knowledge that had been known to railroads for decades. At Beverly Hills, designer Art Pillsbury, who eventually worked on more than half of the championship caliber board tracks nationwide, first employed the Cyril Spiral Eastman curve, and the effect of car handling was pronounced. According to Pillsbury, a correctly engineered track could be driven without steering input from the driver. The car would steer itself simply due to the track geometry. The effects of these changes were higher concerning speeds and higher G-forces on drivers, but not necessarily greater safety. Driver fatalities continued to mount on board tracks into the 1920s and included 4 Indianapolis 500 winners, 3 of which occurred at the Altoona track, another Pillsbury design, in Tipton, Pennsylvania, and 3 in the same year in which the driver won at Indianapolis. Winner of the 1919 Indianapolis 500, Howdy Wilcox, died in an Altoona race on September 4, 1923, while co-1924 winner Joe Boyer and 1929 winner Ray Keech both suffered fatal accidents at the facility in the same years as their Indianapolis 500 wins. Gaston Chevrolet, winner of the 1920 Indianapolis 500, perished that same autumn on November 25, 1920, in a Thanksgiving race at the Beverly Hills track. Even when the cars did not crash, racing on a board track was exceedingly dangerous due to the flying wood splinters and debris. In one oral history taken from a driver, he told a tale of wooden shards driven into the faces of drivers and riding mechanics, and sudden catastrophic tire failures caused by track conditions. Cars were fitted with anti-splinter devices to protect their radiators. Other protective devices hadn't been invented yet: seat belts, roll bars, or fire protection. Drivers often were ejected from their cars and would fall tens of feet. Many fatalities occurred, often involving spectators. The Velodrome at Nutley, New Jersey, a 8th-mile oval banked at 45 degrees, generating lap times of 8 seconds or less, and built from 1x12-inch lumber on edge, was unquestionably the deadliest. On September 8, 1912, Texas cyclone Eddie Hasha was killed at the Velodrome in Newark, New Jersey, in an accident which also killed another racer, 4 spectators, and injured 10 more. The deaths made front page of the New York Times, and the press started calling the short quarter-mile and one-third-mile circuits murder-dromes. The 1913 motorcycle championship races were moved to a dirt track because the dirt was safer. The national organization overseeing motorcycle racing banned all competitions on board tracks shorter than 1 mile in 1919. One by one, the manufacturers withdrew their support due to the negative publicity. A major contributor to the demise of board tracks was the high cost of maintenance. There was no suitable wood preservative available, and depending on climate, tracks needed new boards every 5 years on average. Resurfacing required as much as 1 million board feet of new lumber, 1.25 miles of track, which would have cost around $125,000 at the prices prevalent at the time. Thus, during the last decade of the board tracks, carpenters would repair the tracks from below. sometimes even during a race while cars raced overhead at 120 miles per hour or faster. An additional factor was that the speeds increased overtaking become more difficult. The fastest car would almost always win the race as long as it held together long enough to finish. This led to spectators turning their attention to less predictable racing that was taking place on dirt tracks. Though board tracks disappeared from the national championship scene in 1932, a few smaller tracks did continue to operate for some years afterward. For instance, the Coney Island Velodrome hosted midget racing until at least 1939, and Castle Hill Speedway in the Bronx ran midget races into the 1940s. So let's get into the Altoona board track, or Altoona Speedway. Now, according to Pennsylvania's Lost Raceways, sitting in Tipton, PA lies the grounds of the former Altoona Speedway. The track was neither dirt or paved. It was a 1.25-mile made track out of wooden boards. These types of tracks were generally inexpensive compared to others. Board tracks were known for Harley-Davidson and Indian motorcycles, which eventually led to open-wheel racing. Racing first began at the Speedway on September 4th, 1923, and was sanctioned by the AAA. Board tracks were also known for their high speeds, high ranked turns, and fatality rate. Most, if not all, of the races were sanctioned by AAA. A total of 3 fatalities came from Altoona, and they were all Indianapolis 500 winners. All but 4 board tracks remained open out of the 24 total by 1931. Most were shut down due to the Great Depression. The last race ever held at the board track occurred on September 7, 1931. Dirt races were supposedly held from 1935 to 1938. The board track received damage after a flood in 1935 and was greatly vandalized. An airport was then built right through the track, and then it was paved for a drag strip. The Speedway grounds are now an industrial park. A board from the Speedway remains on display at the Eastern Museum of Motor Racing. So now that you know all about the history of board track racing and the Altoona Speedway, let's go down and see what it looks like today, or at least the area in which it sat. So where I'm standing right now is the beginning of the airstrip or drag strip, which would be the red dot that you're looking at. And it's really hard to believe, staring down at this drag strip, that, you know, planes landed and took off here and cars drag raced down this strip, you know, millions of times. And it's even more so hard to believe that there was a wooden racetrack surrounding this, and it was one of the most important speedways in the United States. To me, this is just as interesting as exploring the pyramids of Giza in Egypt. So I hope you guys learned something. I definitely did by putting this together. And for all you youngsters out there that didn't know that there was a board track right outside of Altoona, well, you do now. Thank you for watching.
Check it out, man. I mean, this merch is like really sick.
Check me out, bro.